They've sold over 200 million records.
You're pretty good, he said, but you'd be a lot better if you had a drummer like me.
They traveled thousands of miles to play to audiences across the globe.
You have such a connection, it's almost like ESP on stage.
They made 6 #1 albums.
His beats just pushed you on and affected your own performance.
But at the heart of the band, there was just one pounding rhythm.
He drummed his way to the top of the heap with some fantastic, innovating, monstrous, scary drumming.
There are some musicians who define an instrument,
He would never, ever miss a beat. It was unbelievable.
who are inextricably linked to the sound they create.
I really felt like I'd been punched in the stomach by that bass drum.
30 years ago, on the morning of September 25th, 1980, one such artist was found dead. In his tragically short life, he became known the world over as the powerhouse behind rock giants Led Zeppelin.
I just realised then it was a kind of an end of an era, because how do you replace someone as important as that in a band?
On December 4th, 1980, Led Zeppelin announced the end. We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep respect we have for his family, together with the sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager, have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were.
The number of people who claimed publicly that they could be the drummer in Led Zeppelin, big, famous musicians, nobody could be the drummer in Led Zeppelin.
Now, 30 years after he fell silent, this is the story of a man regarded by many as the greatest rock drummer of all time. I'm Dave Grohl with the John Bonham story. John Henry Bonham was born on May 31st, 1948. Named after his father and grandfather, he was fascinated by rhythm from an early age. John's younger sister, Deborah.
Before he could walk, the first thing he would do was play with spoons on pots and pans. He was just wanting to drum and hit something, which used to drive my mum mad.
When he was 10, his parents bought him a snare drum. And at 15, his first kit, which he later described as almost prehistoric. He eventually saved up enough to buy second-hand drums that were close to the real thing. Chris Welch was a journalist for Melody Maker in the 60s and has since become well known as a Zeppelin and Bonham biographer.
He had a lot of influences. It wasn't just rock and roll. He liked jazz quite a bit. He was quite impressed by people like Gene Krupa. He also listened to Joe Morello of the Dave Brubeck Quartet. All these influences came together in his playing.
John got his influence from Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich, because my mom and dad used to play those bands all the time, and they loved the Tommy Dorsey Band and Glenn Miller and Harry James and Frank Sinatra. And that's what he used to play to in the shed until the neighbours would come round and start banging on the door to my mum. Tell him to turn it down!
Vanilla Fudge drummer and John Bonham's friend, Carmine Appice.
He took from everybody, like myself. I took from the old masters. He listened to those same kind of guys. That's where he got his soul. He listened to R&B.
He had that knowledge about big band drumming. Somebody who impressed him a lot was a guy called Sonny Payne, who played with Count Basie's band. He was brilliant at juggling sticks and a tremendous soloist on tunes like Old Man River.
He had all the elements from all areas of drumming to draw from, you know, and he definitely utilized it.
He was exposed to that kind of drumming when he was younger, and so he brought it all together in his own playing.
He definitely didn't have any formal drum lessons. It was just... My mum actually wanted him to. She wanted him to learn how to read music. And I think later on he sort of said, I wished I had. But it was just all feel. It was all soul. It just came from inside, and he felt it. He felt the rhythm.
After hearing Sandy Nelson's Teen Beat in 1959, John knew he had to be in a band. Chris Welch.
Before John Bonham joined Led Zeppelin, he had quite a lot of experience playing with other bands. I think his first school group was called the Avengers.
John hung out at the Redditch Youth Club, where he met the Blue Star Trio. When drummer Bill Harvey quit, John joined Terry Beale and Mickey Ellis. Bill Harvey.
He fitted in marvellously. I mean, he was just as if he'd been playing with them for ages, you know. He was very adaptable. On top of that, he was self-taught, which made a heck of a difference, because you could pick things up, you didn't have to sort of rehearse too much.
When he became more of a semi-pro musician, he joined a group called Terry Webb and the Spiders, and they were a kind of teddy boy group.
One night, they supported Brian Poole and the Tremolos, the band that Decca signed instead of the Beatles. By now, John's reputation as a drummer was growing.
If you were really good, then you did sort of make a name for yourself, as John did. And I've seen him at nights, see a band in Birmingham. He didn't like the drummer, and he would get up and tell the drummer to move off, and he'd show him how to play.
Drumming wasn't the only thing going on in John's life. He married Pat Phillips on February 16, 1966. John Bonham's son, and a world-class drummer in his own right, Jason Bonham.
I remember Mum telling me stories that when I was first born, you know, they didn't have anywhere to live, really. Mum had gone back home to her parents, and Dad would then come over and visit on the bus.
With his own family to support, John worked for his dad's construction firm. The strength developed from bricklaying by day gave his drumming even more power by night.
The thing about Mr. Bonham was that he put his own stamp on it. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was kind of his own boss. I think it stemmed from being a builder in a funny kind of a way, being a self-employed man of the soil. The way he approached a drum kit was that there was no messing about. He wasn't in the least bit phased by a drum kit.
Eventually, when they got together, he would pretend he was going to work, and he would go to the local drum store and do demonstrations and take whatever he could in cash.
The flourishing Midlands music scene meant there were plenty of bands to play for. These included Danny King and the Mayfair Set, Pat Wayne and the Beachcombers, the Nicky James Movement, and Locomotive, who had a top 30 hit with Rudy's in Love.
There were lots of bands in the Midlands in the early 60s, and John went through quite a few of them. The Crawling King Snakes came later, and that was the band where he first met his future mate, Robert Plant.
I was 16 years old, and I was singing at the Plaza Ballroom in Old Hill, which is in the Black Country. And there was a guy with quite an arrogant air to himself, very cocky, standing watching me. He came up to me and he said, after the show, he said, "You're pretty good." He said, "But you'd be a lot better if you had a drummer like me." So I thought, nobody says that sort of thing to me. Don't they know who I might one day end up being? And anyway, that was the first moment that we ever communicated at all. You know, we tried it out, and he joined the Crawling King Snakes for a while, and it was the beginning of a fantastic exchange of energies between us over the years. Not always particularly smooth, but always pretty dynamic and a little controversial. But, I mean, what a great way to introduce yourself.
John was happy to move around different groups, as long as he was able to get on stage and perform.
John was so good, everybody wanted him in the bands. You knew that your relationship with John was going to change when he decided to get the drums out of the van to clean them, because you'd never see him again. "I just want to clean me drums, mate," he'd say, and that would be the end of that. You know, he'd be off with somebody else for a couple of months.
All the while, Bonham was developing as a drummer. Early drumming partner Bill Harvey.
I think the one thing that marked John out from anybody else that stage was his adaptability of his bass drum or kick drum technique, which absolutely flabbergasted all of us, and I think it's flabbergasted a lot of people, the way he could do the triplets with the bass drum. I asked him once how he did it, and he said, "Oh, no, I'm not going to tell you, but I'll tell you what I have done." He said, "I've took the leather strap off the bass drum pedal, and I've put a boat chain on instead." And of course, now all the bass drum pedals are chain driven. So he, to my mind, he was the first one that ever did that.
Black Sabbath drummer and Bonham's friend since the Brumbeat days, Bill Ward.
I think I was about 16, and I think he was 16 as well, or 17. I always used to watch him as he set up his bass drum. Didn't matter what bass drum he had, because he always got that sound. One day we were in a very small club. Bonzo was checking his bass drum, and he said, can you feel that in your gut? He was measuring the force of his bass drums, and on that particular night he was using me as the response part. My stomach felt it. I mean, I really felt like I'd been punched in the stomach.
Bonham and Robert Plant joined forces again in Band of Joy.
I remember we played Exeter University once. Bonzo had been drinking the cider and decided to play the entire set standing up. And Kevin was also a very interesting guitarist. They had a huge row all the way from Exeter to Worcester about who's the worst timekeeper out of the two of them. Bonzo sobered up by the time we got to the Midlands, and Kevin got out the van and left the group.
Bonham had steadily developed a reputation for being the loudest drummer in England. Bill Harvey.
When John first took over from me in the Blue Stars, it was mentioned to Teddy Beale, well, what do you think of your new drummer now? He says, well, I'll tell you one thing. He's damn loud.
Another band that Bonham played in around this time was Way of Life, along with Dave Pegg from Fairport Convention.
We were always too loud. We'd be told to go away.
He was loud because he was so driven. I mean, when he was playing, he was into it. You could have tapped him on the shoulder and he wouldn't have, he was gone. He said to me once, he said, just hit him, bash him out, Bill. He said, and that was his attitude.
Band of Joy built enough of a reputation to be asked to play at London's legendary Speakeasy Club. It was the birthplace to many rock and roll stars, and incidentally, a place that Led Zeppelin would later get banned from.
Bonzo had got the van and he decided to park it by his mother-in-law's house against some railings in a pub in an estate in Dudley. So he backed it right up to the railings, and we drove down to London and got to this club. And then we realised that we'd left the door handle to the van in the railings back in the Black Country. So we couldn't open the door to get the gear out. So we saw some workers who were working, and we borrowed a spade. We rammed the spade between the back doors and edged the door bit by bit open. Bonzo was working on the door. As the door sprung open, Keith Moon comes down the street in his Rolls Royce, and Bonzo saw this car and saw Mooney and threw the spade to me. Because, of course, drummers shouldn't be seen doing anything like that. So we went in the club and set up, and it was a funny, very small stage, and I remember, the singer usually stands at the front, that's how it works, but not with John. He'd actually put his drum kit right on the edge of the front of the stage.
Band of Joy opened for American folk singer Tim Rose several times. They had disbanded when Rose returned to the UK a few months later, so he invited Bonham to play drums for him. Chris Welch.
For drummers in those days, the thing was, do you have a regular gig? Are you being paid properly? So that was a thrill in itself. Because he'd been through lots of pub bands and groups that lasted for a short period of time or didn't pay particularly well. So playing with Tim Rose was good.
Tim wasn't the only well-known artist who wanted Bonham. Joe Cocker was also interested, along with one Jimmy Page, fresh out of the Yardbirds. Looking to create a new band, provisionally called the New Yardbirds, Page recruited bass player John Paul Jones, who Jimmy had worked with in his early session days. Next came a vocalist. Terry Reid, the first choice, was too busy. Step forward, Robert Plant.
Been dazed and confused for so long, it's not true.
And so that just left one role to fill.
Jimmy had got a drummer lined up for what would transpire to be Led Zepp. And I said, oh no, you've got to see this guy. So we went to see John, and he was obviously great.
Jimmy Page.
I thought he was tremendous, absolutely tremendous. He was just so complete as a drummer. They had another drummer in mind. Obviously, I was going to try and pull in people that I was aware of. When I saw John, well, that was it. I just knew that it was all going to be absolutely superb.
I went up at the end and I introduced him to Jimmy, and I said, you know, this is a great band, it's the Yardbirds. He said, I can't come anywhere near you. Pat's told me, not a chance, I can't work with you again. Every time you go off with Planty, you come back with no money and something's wrong, you know. Not quite a social disease, but, you know, it took about 4 or 5 trips and all sorts of coercion before Pat finally said, okay, then.
When the Tim Rose tour moved to Middleborough, the band arrived to find that John wasn't there. He'd not officially told them that he decided to leave. Led Zeppelin bass player John Paul Jones.
The very first rehearsal that I met him, as a bass player, the first thing you think of is, I wonder what the drummer's going to be like. And I'd not met him at all before.
The first song the new band played in rehearsal was Train Kept A-Rollin' by the Yardbirds. Jimmy Page.
We still had some Yardbird concerts to fulfill in Scandinavia. So we did some Yardbirds material as well as some new numbers. All of the rehearsal, we knew we just had something that other people didn't have. It was a totally unique sounding group. I'm searching for an adjective because it's very difficult to come up with one. But I'm going to say that really hackneyed one, but it was awesome.
It's like an explosion in the room. And I knew by about the third beat that, this is fantastic. He's going to be great. Just the feel, the attitude. I think I'd hardly spoken to him, but just playing that first song with him, it was just amazing. And I knew we could really work together.
And everybody in the room, all 4 of us, knew that this was something that was beyond anything that anybody else was doing. You know, the whole approach to it, the musicianship, everyone was a musical equal, which was superb. We just knew that we had it there.
Over the years, we developed a sort of empathy, I suppose. We just wanted to work very tightly together and kick everything up the arse, I suppose.
Their first gig, under the name The New Yardbirds for legal reasons, was in Copenhagen on September the 14th, 1968.
I don't know how much he'd travelled before he joined our band. In fact, come to think of it, I don't think he'd actually flown before. We actually flew to our first gig. So it was all very new to him.
After a week-long Scandinavian tour, the band went home to record their debut album in time for the first UK tour. That kicked off on October the 15th, 1968, at Surrey University.
There were a lot of bands coming up at that time. Led Zeppelin, or the New Yardbirds as they were called, people were slightly confused about who they were and who was in it. The first few months of their life, it was a bit of a battle, a bit of a struggle to get recognised. Obviously, word spread, very quickly, I think. After the initial gigs, I think people realised there was something special about them. And, of course, the debut album was in the pipeline. And as soon as that hit the record shops, then Zeppelin Fever took off.
We'd rehearsed it, we'd played it in Scandinavia, and then we went into the studio at Olympic Studios. The actual total recording time and mixing time, I believe, was 36 hours. The idea, was to go in and really capture what it was that we had, that character and identity.
Released in January 1969, the first album, Led Zeppelin, went gold within weeks. Chris Welch.
John Bonham's drumming was a high point for me on the first Led Zeppelin album. Beautifully recorded and had that kind of sense of presence which Jimmy Page always insisted on.
He had an incredible natural balance over his drum kit. He didn't have to sort of compensate, say for somebody who had a weak bass drum or something. Everything, if he was going to do an accent, you'd hear that accent. The balance that he had made him very easy to record, of course.
All 4 musicians were given space to express themselves, including John Bonham, particularly on Good Times, Bad Times.
That was one of the original riffs that I wrote, actually. His drumming was particularly effective on that. There's lots of breaks in it as well, so he could. We both did almost little solo bits, and obviously the rhythm worked, fairly driving rhythm.
We took them on their very first tour with Vanilla Fudge. And I said to him, I love that triplet thing. And he said, well, I got it from you. I said, you didn't get it from me. I don't do that triplet thing. And he said, yes, you did. If you go to, I think it was the song Ticket to Ride, I might be wrong, on the first Vanilla Fudge album. He said, you did that triplet. It's right there on the record. I said, I did? I didn't know that. And I did it between my hand and the foot, and he just did with his foot. So it's just a matter of taking a concept and exploring that concept to the fullest, and that's what he did. And he opened up a whole new door for a lot of drummers by doing that, including myself.
In the studio, I mean, his personality was much more introspective, I think. He was a good worker. He was very conscientious about getting the parts right and getting them interesting, and I mean, as we all were.
I'm Eddie Kramer, producer and engineer. Very fortunate enough to have worked with Led Zeppelin, and in particular John Bonham, who I feel was the greatest bloody rock and roll drummer who ever lived. Bonham would throw in his own stuff, and he would always surprise the hell out of you, because he would throw in a fill that you would scratch your head and go, I don't believe he just did that. We would listen back and would be laughing because it was just so insane.
If you listen to a Zeppelin album, the most prominent thing on the record is the drums. That's an old R&B concept. If you listen to all these old R&B records, like from Atlantic and Stax and Motown, the drums are probably the loudest thing on the track. Because, you know, when you have loud drums on the track, that's when the track really drives. Jimmy Page knew that, and the bass drum was probably the loudest thing on the mix.
Jimmy Page.
He was constantly working on his technique and trying really, really difficult things, pushing himself all the time, pushing his abilities, and fueled by his imagination.
Led Zeppelin played their first gig in America on December 26, 1968, in Denver Coliseum, Colorado. When they returned for their second U.S. tour in April 1969, they were a headline act. Robert Plant.
We loved each other without a doubt. But the pressures and the kind of territory that we went into was uncharted for anybody, really. We didn't know what was happening. Nobody did, really, because the way that the business evolved and our reputation and Led Zeppelin's persona developed so quickly, it was a total underground movement in America, you know. As it was in the UK, I mean, we just didn't know what was happening. That first album really created some kind of amazing combustion. The awareness occasionally, you just kind of came up for air in the middle of a tour or recording another record and realized our music itself had become like a sort of gathering point for legions of people, and that's very difficult to deal with because you have to go out in amongst those people a lot.
As soon as John started earning serious money with the band, he was able to indulge a lifetime obsession. Not drums, but cars. His sister Deborah.
There was never one car that was enough for John. He's picked up one car, driven it up home, and by the time he got it up to the Hyde, it was like, nah, get rid of it. Get rid of it, can't drive that.
Jason Bonham.
I think there was about 15 or 16 cars in front of the house, which ranged from XK150, XK120, Jensen Interceptor, Aston Martin Vantage, Bentley Continental, Corniche Rolls-Royce, Silver Cloud, Mini Cooper, pretty much you name it. Dad had it.
John Paul Jones.
I can remember looking out of my window in the Continental Hyatt house, and John had just taken delivery of a new Trans Am, very fast car. And it turned out he'd been stopped doing, 90 miles an hour up Sunset Strip by the police. And I was watching this. And at first it was like, you could see them hands on their guns and all this sort of, out of the car, blah, 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 blah. He starts chatting to them. Next moment, the hood's popped. And they're all looking at the engine. And I talked to him after. I said, what on earth did you do? I said, well, I'm very excited. I've got this new car. Just done this great gig at the Forum. And anyways, you've got to see this. He talked them round the front of the car. They forgot all about the fact that he'd been speeding. They're discussing the engine. Only he could do that. I'd be in jail.
Led Zeppelin entered the new decade well in their stride, with second album Led Zeppelin II knocking the Beatles' Abbey Road off the top of the Billboard charts.
Good evening. Tonight, a musical surprise as the Beatles topple. Hear this.
It's cool, it's groovy, it's number one, the Led Zeppelin.
The Led, what?
The Led Zeppelin, but I'm afraid that you and other dads like you, Bob, may never have heard of them. But this British group has made musical history today. Readers of the Melody Maker have voted them the top world group. The significance is that the Beatles have held this title for 8 years. But now, the Beatles are out.
Led Zeppelin were all powerful, and they were the band everybody wanted to see and hear. And of course, Melody Maker readers were all avid Led Zeppelin fans.
John Bonham, interviewed by the BBC at the time.
I think it's changing. That's the main thing, you see. I think that's why the awards have changed, because the kids are changing for a start, and so is the music. Let's say the public, you know, it's not just say the kids, because we've had sort of all sorts of people at concerts, you know. I think that they're coming to listen to what you're playing and not just to look at you and see what you are. I mean, when I first went to see the Beatles, it was to look at them, you know. You didn't really bother what you were listening to.
Yes.
And today, it's not what you are, it's what you're playing.
Led Zeppelin set a new precedent in rock, with each band member taking an equal billing on stage. Touring in the early days had a real impact on their musical horizons. Robert Plant.
When we went off to America, we were really exposed to so much more breadth of music, and John really devoured the great drummers of the time, Alphonse Mouzon, Bernard Purdie.
Bernard Purdie, ladies and gentlemen, on the drums.
His early initiation was when we traveled with Vanilla Fudge in the very early days.
Vanilla Fudge drummer, Carmine Appice.
I listened to the record and I thought he was a really good drummer, so I called up Ludwig and I said, listen, there's this new group, it's called Led Zeppelin. It's a drummer named John Bonham, who's really a tremendous drummer. I think they're going to be really big. I think we should give him an endorsement, and he wants a kit just like mine. So we sent him the record, and through that, and through him calling up, and then them getting a hold of him, they put a deal together. But then, you know, that had to be an understatement that he was going to be big, an understatement of 4 decades, you know?
He was a tough player, a hard player, but within it all, he was a very precise player, prone to occasional experiments which might not quite come off perfectly. So not only was he rehearsing in his head, but he was rehearsing in the middle of songs, which was always a bit of a laugh.
I said, wow, listen to this guy's foot. It's unbelievable. How did he do that? And then I figured it out. And when I heard that foot, it was like, my God, this guy's an animal.
He was fantastic because he didn't stray into those absolute tosh areas of drumming, which are just... I mean, he got the tricks where he could go round the kit with his left hand and spin the drumstick with his right hand. He was pretty choosy about when he did that, and he used humour. Because I always used to want to play shuffles or blues stuff at rehearsals, and he'd play along with it, playing a... you know, type of 6/8 type of thing. And then it tap, 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 and we go into a waltz. Because he was bored and he had enough of it, you know. Ha! Which was spectacular, the bastard.
John Bonham's friend, Black Sabbath drummer Bill Ward.
He had such dexterity and he was so light of foot that he was able to nail exactly how you're supposed to nail a bass drum. And he put it right in the sweet spot every time. And that just came so naturally, or I felt it came naturally from him.
We went back on tour with Led Zeppelin in '69 in the summer, and both of us had the same drum kit. And that was the last tour he did, the double bass, was from what I understand. Robert and Jimmy thought it was too busy with the double bass. And when you took that one bass drum away, that's what became the Led Zeppelin drum set, with the big bass drum and one big tom up front. That became his iconic setup.
This is Dave Grohl with the John Bonham Story on BBC Radio 2. Zeppelin fever spread during the early 70s. Along with the newfound fame and wealth came the touring. Their own private plane, the infamous Starship. Friend to Bonham and lead singer with Bad Company, who were signed to Zeppelin's label Swan Song, Paul Rodgers.
Starship was an amazing aeroplane. It was huge, with bedrooms, complete with beds, and huge seat belts. It had, you know, video games and all the rock star stuff.
John and Pat and Morris Gibb and myself used to hang out a lot together. In fact, when John was in London, he was always at our house.
Singer Lulu was friends with Led Zeppelin at the time.
Being on the road, it does drive you a bit stir-crazy. You lose your privacy and, you know, you can't even go out your hotel rooms because people just want a piece of you. So I think that's sort of what encourages the excesses.
Carmine Apiece.
There was too many funny things we did on the road. Just some crazy, wild stuff, you know. Some stuff we can't even talk about on the radio.
It has an effect, this business, of giving you a high adrenaline rush. But you have to come down from that. And that's why drugs and alcohol numb you out a little bit. But at some point, you have to come down. And it's not easy.
Chris Welch remembers being on the road with the band in 1971 at the Belfast gig, which was the first time the band performed this little number in public.
I remember saying to Robert, what was that song called? He said, oh, did you like it? Yeah, it's called Stairway to Heaven. I said, oh, great, it's a nice tune. When I finally went to sleep, I heard all the shouting and banging outside the corridor. I heard John saying to Peter, who was banging on the door of his manager, he said, Peter, I've done a terrible thing. I've hit Robert. He said, shut up and go to bed. There'd been some altercation between Robert and Bonzo. God knows what it was about.
It was a dynamic relationship. Sometimes we'd disagree, we'd kind of fall out, but we'd stick it out because for the good of the whole thing. But inherently, you know, he was a really good man to me.
He had tremendous respect for Jimmy Page and loved Robert as well, and John Paul Jones, who incidentally they worked together incredibly well. John Paul Jones and Bonzo, they filmed the world's greatest rock women section.
Led Zeppelin bass player John Paul Jones.
The thing about Bonzo is that he was a great listener, and we listened to each other. If in the parts that you work out, you leave like little spaces, a beat would pop out, a snare drum would pop out, a kick drum would pop out. And likewise, he'd do the same. And so our parts fitted together rather than both playing hell for leather, as it were. And I think that's what made the rhythm section particularly effective.
Paul Rogers.
You could actually focus in on any aspect of their music. If you tune out the vocals and the guitar and just listen to the rhythm, you can hear a whole world down there that's going on. Not only are they speaking to each other, but they're also very much aware of what Jimmy and Robert are doing all the time, and very much supportive of what they do. And there's this incredible exchange, as there is with a really good band, and they really had that down.
It didn't really matter what you threw at him. He would come up with something that was really interesting and usually pretty groovy. And he was very inspiring in that way. His beats just pushed you on and affected your own performance.
It was much easier for him to connect with me in my changes than it was for the other two guys to connect with me. Because we were from the same place, we'd played together before this amazing phenomena, he could tap into parts of me that Jimmy and Jonesy either didn't know about or hadn't bothered to connect with.
Jimmy Page.
He was a really good, solid friend. He was. Like he played the drums, he was a real dependable man, you know. He had a great sense of humour, and he was fun. He was certainly larger than life when he was playing the drums, and I think with most drummers, but in particularly John, that sort of spills out into their personal life. He was flamboyant, and you know, with his taste and his attitude and his humour, and he was great.
He made friends with everybody. He was a very generous man. But some of the nicest moments was watching him meeting other people. He could win over anybody.
Carmine Apiece on his relationship with the man known to some as the Beast.
The great thing about him, no matter how drunk he was and everything, with me, he always had respect, you know, and we always were good buddies, you know. Whenever I'd see him, he'd come over, give me a big hug, a big bear hug. He was a wild guy, but he was like a big teddy bear.
John's younger sister, Deborah.
I think there's two very different sides to John. I mean, one of his things for him was he found it incredibly lonely on tour, trying to switch that off the home life and become John the musician. I think the actual playing part was fine, but it was all the rest, the hotels, the travelling, the not seeing his wife and the kids. He really did find that difficult. So I think then the other side came out if he had a drink.
When the band weren't on tour, John loved life in the country with his family. In 1972, he started looking for a house and found the old Hyde Farm. Paul Rogers.
He built the farmhouse himself, actually. You know, there's pictures of him covered in cement and laying bricks, and he was a really down-to-earth guy like that and got really stuck in.
It was just, that's finished, I'm back home, let's get the tweed jackets on and the check shirts and the jumpers and the flat caps and get in with the cows and get me tractor out, and that was it, you know, and then down to the pub, and he was happy as anything, as long as he was doing something. He had building projects with my dad, and they sort of bought up old properties around the area and did them up.
Bonham's friend, Dave Pegg.
He had a problem being away from home. He was very content to be at home on the farm, and he had lots of things he could do there.
Took my chances on a big jet plane. Never let them tell you that we're all the same.
I think it might have got him down a bit, but you know, it's like that with bands. You have to do it. You can't not get in the van, or in their case, in your private plane.
Led Zeppelin concerts got bigger and bigger. Jason Bonham.
The first time I remember seeing my father on stage would be in the United States. I remember actually looking across because there was that many people there. I remember asking my dad, who else is playing? And he said, no one, it's just us. And I'm like, yeah, right, not that good. He really was.
At every concert, each of the four players got their chance to shine, with John taking center stage during his now legendary drum solos. Initially known as Pat's Delight, this song featured on the second album, Led Zeppelin II, as Moby Dick. Jimmy Page.
We'd do the Moby Dick intro, then he'd start playing, and he'd go through everything. He'd be doing complicated rhythm patterns, you know, it's his chance to have some fun.
His solos were very dynamic. They had power. They had very high points. They had low points as far as dynamics and volume. He'd take your audience on a trip, and that's what he did very well.
Rock singer Paul Rogers.
It's amazing how he seems to have a kind of metronome in the center of where his heart is, I guess, you know? His limbs would just be... and he would never, ever miss a beat. It was unbelievable.
There was another drum solo John did later, which was Bonzo's Montreux, which appeared on the Coda album, which Jimmy put together as a tribute to him.
Well, he'd always been keen to do something that was a bit like a drum orchestra. Well, not a bit like, a drum orchestra. At the time he was in Montreux, and we'd set aside some time to do it, so I went over there with him, and we got all the drums and the many pieces of drum utensils and stuff, you know, paraphernalia. But he knew what he was going to do. He laid down the rhythm track and then started to lay on the timbales and timpani, kettle drums, and he knew. He had this whole vision of what he wanted to do. Unfortunately, he wasn't around for the mixing of it, but I knew. I was with him when we did it, and I knew what the thing was all about. You know, his idea of doing a drum orchestra, and I think it was really successful. Ambitious, but he pulled it off.
One of the many percussive techniques he grew famous for was playing with his hands.
I remember seeing one performance and there was blood spattered all over the cymbals and all over the drums because he'd cut his hand hitting the edge of the cymbal.
We'd retire from the stage, and the key to this was how would you know when to go back on? Well, when he picked up the sticks again after the hands and the timpani, didn't really know how long he was going to go on for, but there'd be a cue, somebody come running down from the stage, sticks! And then we knew that there was going to be however long, could be 5 minutes, could be 10 minutes, could be 15 minutes even from that point. But that was his time to do whatever he wanted.
While they weren't touring, Led Zeppelin kept busy with side projects, like launching their own record label, Swan Song. They released their 6th studio album, Physical Graffiti, in February 1975. It was their first double album, and it sold 1 million advance copies. Journalist Chris Welch.
John's drumming, once again, was a very important, powerful aspect of that album, particularly on standout tracks like Kashmir, which is now regarded as a fantastic Led Zeppelin classic. But at the time, it wasn't viewed that way at all. It was greeted with some dismay, and even within Zeppelin's own camp. I think Richard Cole and Peter Grant referred to Kashmir as the dirge. They thought, it's far too slow and dreary. What is all this about? Of course, the spooky atmosphere and this sort of rolling, doomy drumming in the background, I think began to grip people's imagination.
All I see turns to ground.
Robert Plant.
You hear that bass drum and you just go, oh yeah, it's beautiful stuff. He was able to be sparing and yet at the same time flatten you.
I liked his playing personally on Trampled Underfoot, which he had this very fast, driving, surging beat, showing his soul and funk roots, really.
I just started playing this riff on the clavinet, and he came in with this glorious stomp. He had this great feel. And apart from technique, he just has this great, great soul and groove, which is the most essential thing for a drummer. And he could play in front of the beat, he could play behind it, depending, what was needed. Sometimes in his own tune. Trampled Underfoot was great for that because it had this swagger, and it was a different type of song for the band. I mean, he was very versatile. He could really play anything in any style. He wasn't stuck playing, a rock beat or a rock drummer beat.
Physical Graffiti topped the charts around the world. Led Zeppelin became the first rock band in history to have all their albums in the Billboard Top 200 at the same time. And the success kept coming. The album which followed, Presence, went platinum in America on advance orders alone. Robert Plant.
There's a track on Presence called For Your Life and also Achilles' Last Stand. And they really exemplify how he could move like the tide within a track and create so much excitement.
John Paul Jones.
John's drumming on Achilles' Last Stand was ferocious. It was a ferocious number, I seem to remember. It's a complicated part. It takes a lot of technique to keep going and to sound fresh.
I had a beautiful girlfriend who, one time I was playing Achilles' Last Stand, and it was so remarkable to hear it, and I don't play Led Zeppelin music much. And she turned to me and she said, I wouldn't like to get left alone in a room with this. Ha ha! Which means we were doing a fantastic job.
The UK premiere of Led Zeppelin's film The Song Remains the Same happened in London on November 4th, 1976. In between footage of their live shows, there are fantasy sequences from each band member. John's sister, Deborah.
The song remains the same. I think for John, just shows him as a real down-to-earth guy, really. Just everything that John was about, a family man. He's got his wife, he's got Jason playing the drums, the home, the farm, and his passion of driving cars. He couldn't envisage doing like a fantasy scene like the others did. It wasn't really John, so he kept it very real.
Led Zeppelin returned to the States in 1977 for their 11th U.S. tour. Whenever there was a break, John flew home to see his family. John Paul Jones.
I came out of boarding school and my parents were always on tour, so I'd never really had that sort of life. So it's hard for me, I suppose, to imagine what it was like. When we used to go up to his hometown, we'd meet all his friends, and he seemed to have hundreds and hundreds of friends. And lots of family, and, so there was a lot to miss.
Promoter Harvey Goldsmith.
He would kind of look at it and say, how many more shows you got? I want to get home. I want to see my family. And and he just felt he wanted to get back into a reality check.
You know, for me, the big thing that we used to do when Dad wasn't touring was the big family vacation, which was always a couple of months in the south of France. And that was great times, very fun. We would have these It's a Knockout parties where we would set up a bunch of lilos across the swimming pool and try and run across. I, as a child, used to love watching these drunken 23-year-olds or 25-year-olds running across, but little did I know these kind of people were the likes of Lulu and Maurice Gibb, Ringo, and a lot of my dad's friends. It was very great times, I must say, and I cherished them.
At the end of July, tragedy struck, as news arrived that Robert's son Carrick had died.
When we lost our boy in 1977 and Carrick passed away, my link with my music and my past and my present and my success was basically kept alive by John, which was the right thing to do, you know, and he did it.
The last 7 dates of the tour were canceled. Led Zeppelin would never return to America. Led Zeppelin played at Knebworth in August 1979. They hadn't played live for 2 years, and the demand for tickets was so huge that they scheduled an extra date. John's sister Deborah was 17 at the time.
John had come round to the house and said this, you know, they're going to do this big show, Knebworth House. And I said, oh, fantastic. I can't wait to see him. He said, well, you know what? I don't think you should come to this one. It's because it's outdoor. I don't really want family there. I've got some indoor shows coming up, and you can come to those. And I just looked at him and said, no, I'm coming. I remember thinking, funny enough, that if I didn't see him then, I wouldn't see him again. I actually told my mum that. I said, if I don't go, Mum, I just don't think I'll see him play again. I got there, and then I tried to get him backstage. And told the guy that I was John Bonham's sister. He was like, oh, yeah, where'd you pass? Bye-bye. And then it got quite frantic because I didn't let it go, you know. And the next thing, he picked me up and threw me against the fence. And at that point, Richard Cole, the tour manager, came out going, oh, it's Bonzo's sister, let her in, let her in. John came round the corner and he just saw me and he ran, picked me up in the air, and I burst into tears. And he just hugged me and held me for ages and then put me down and said, what did I say to you about not coming? So, yeah, it was great. But, of course, I never got to see him play live again.
The Knebworth shows were Led Zeppelin's last UK performances. On the 17th of June, 1980, Led Zeppelin embarked on their first European tour since the early 70s. Promoter Harvey Goldsmith.
I produced the last European tour, which was the last time that Bonzo actually played with the band. And at that time, he seemed to be tired. There were no signs that he was giving up the ghost or anything like that, but it was a grueling tour as it happened.
On June 27th, during a concert at Nuremberg, John collapsed on stage, said to be suffering from physical exhaustion. The show was canceled, but John managed to complete the tour, which finished with the last ever Led Zeppelin gig in Berlin on July 7th, 1980.
Everybody was tired on stage, and I think Bonzo, clearly, in hindsight, was particularly tired.
The band were booked to do a North American tour later in the year. In September, the band started rehearsing in Jimmy's house in Windsor. On the 24th of that month, John drank hard, all day. On the morning of September 25th, 1980, John Bonzo Bonham was found dead by John Paul Jones and tour manager Benji Lefebvre.
I just could not believe that it had happened, so it was devastating. It was just unbelievably devastating.
The inquest on October 8th revealed that John had died from inhalation of vomit during his sleep. The cause of death was put down to consumption of alcohol, and a verdict of accidental death was recorded. Friend Dave Pegg.
I was very shocked when I heard what had happened to John, the way that he kind of left us all, you know. I never imagined he would go like that. The circumstances are incredibly sad.
My mom and dad, to lose your son. My other brother Michael lost his best friend. And my sister-in-law Pat lost her husband, you know, Jason. To lose your dad at such an age. And Zoe, who was only 5, who never really got to know John. So it was just, it was devastating. And I can't really remember, much about it. There was a lot of dark years, The light's only starting to shine now, really, a little. You never forget, but time does heal.
I just realised then it was a kind of an end of an era, because how do you replace someone as irascible and as important as that in a band?
The number of people who claimed publicly that they could be the drummer in Led Zeppelin, big, famous musicians, and nobody could be the drummer in Led Zeppelin.
It didn't feel, after having had all those years of having this total free spirit to everything, to have to sort of clamp it down and compromise at that time, certainly at that time of the passing of John, just didn't seem at all palatable.
Because we ground to a halt when we did, you have to assume that that was the end of it. But if you try and get anybody, there's only Jason, and Jason's spectacular, you know, puts his own colour to it.
Jason Bonham, yeah, he's fantastic. When we just did the O2 reunion, he was the star of the show, I thought. I mean, not only did he pull it all off, he took chances. And that takes a lot of guts to do that.
All I was trying to impress on the day was the 3 guys on stage. If I really would have thought about actually who was there, I think it'd have been more nerve-wracking, but just to get a glance or a nod or a wink or a smile from any one of them at any point made me feel like, yeah, this is, I'm doing it, right? This is okay, yeah?
He's a different drummer to his father, but there are certain elements which just remind you of his father. So he's definitely got his dad's genes.
Carmine Apiece.
I started hearing rumors that they were talking about me or Cozy Powell replacing him. And I said, well, I mean, I would love to do that. You know, so I always loved Led Zeppelin, but, you know, it's not going to be the same without John. Sure enough, they just said, you know, without him, we're just not going to continue.
Then the realisation was then they weren't going to do Led Zeppelin anymore, which I think we all felt great relief about because John was an integral part.
Paul Rogers.
I still feel he's still with us in a huge way. He was 32 years old, man. 32 years old. That's a kid, isn't it, nowadays? To me it is, anyway. Something's got to give if you're flying this high, this intense for this long period of time. Still missed. Still missed.
I think John's legacy as a musician has to be the fact that he's inspired so many people to play drums. And I think if he knew that, he'd be so humbled by it. They look to John as their sort of beacon, really. I think that's quite amazing.
We all go crackers at times, and sometimes when he was in free fall, you could hear him where I was in front of him. By the time I got on a bigger stage, I could hear him shouting, "Cannons!" which is fantastic.
He's made more people pick up the sticks and done more for drumming than anybody I can think of. Everybody wants to play like John Bonham.
John Bonham was a complex musician, but a straightforward man. He reached the heights of superstardom when world fame was a newborn and dangerous animal. As a father, husband, brother, and friend, he was clearly loved. And for rock drummers everywhere, including myself, he set the bar at a height that's never been equaled. Here's John's fellow members from Led Zeppelin. Robert Plant.
What John's left is the most powerful picture of restraint, if you can imagine. Because there were the moments, you know, the very famous drum fills that he could do. But in truth, you know, he knew when to stop. He knew when not to play. He knew when to just wait so long before that snare drum came down. And that basically is the coolest and sexiest and most amazing way of telegraphing music, is by never overcooking it.
John Paul Jones.
He just wrote the rule book. There's nobody been even close to doing what he did, and we will miss him terribly.
Jimmy Page.
Well, his legacy is all-encompassing. I mean, he's arguably the best drummer that ever lived. He's certainly the best drummer that was there, present in rock and roll. But it goes way beyond that. It goes way, way beyond that with his playing, because it's so experimental and it goes into so many different areas. So arguably he could be the best drummer that ever lived. And I feel very fortunate to have played with him.
I'm Dave Grohl. The John Bonham Story was produced for BBC Radio 2 at TBI Media by Jenny Nelson and Phil Critchlow.